Hi everyone, and welcome to the launch of the first Swedish Circularity Gap Report. My name is Claes Kullbrand, and I will, together with Elin Larsson here, help you through or guide you through this event. After a few words from me, we will start with a presentation of the main findings from the report. After that, we will have a panel discussion moderated by Elin here and with some very interesting panelists. The Circularity Gap Report for Sweden has been funded by us at Resource and created by the Dutch impact organization Circular Economy together with the Swedish Research Institute RISE. Resource is a strategic innovation program here in Sweden, and we are working towards the vision of material use within the planetary boundaries. Now, we believe it's important to measure circularity. In Sweden, for example, we have a Swedish strategy for circular economy. We have an action plan, circular action plan. We have a delegation for circular economy. And on top of that, we also have lots of both private and public initiatives all working towards or for increasing the circularity of Sweden. But without knowing really where we are starting from or having a baseline measurement, it's difficult to monitor progress. It is also difficult to determine what actions are working and what actions are not. At the same time, we definitely know that measuring circularity is something really complex, something really difficult. So we see this initiative as the start of something rather than something definitive or something final. So we hope that this initiative will evolve and improve over time as it attracts more attention and more talents join this movement. To wrap up this intro, we hope and believe that this report will be used as a basis for discussions throughout the whole society. And we hope that it also finds its way to all the important decision makers in Sweden. So they can use the report to educate them and also perhaps serve as an eye-opener for some of them. So without further ado, let's now kick this launch event off with some nice piece of video. So turn up the volume on your speakers and please enjoy. that energy boost, I would now like to hand over the word to the head of R&D at Circle Economy to present the main findings of the report. And I hope you all heard the sound. It seemed to be working for us here at least. So please welcome Matthew Fraser.
Thank you very much, Klaus. I can confirm that the sound was working. Very nice video, and it was a pleasure to watch. Thank you very much for the introduction. It's really my pleasure to present the findings for the first Circularity Gap Report of Sweden. And I have to say, just as a quick note, it's really been a pleasure working with both you at Resources as well as RISE on this project together. So we've learned quite a lot through this research, and I'm really excited actually just to walk everybody through the key results of the report today. So jumping right into it, without any further ado, I think the big question on everybody's mind is how circular is Sweden? And as we can see on the next slide, we found the circularity metric for Sweden to be 3.4%. Now, this sits below the global average of 8.6%, but it's actually quite comparable to similar nations. So recently we've conducted a study for Norway, and we found that was 2.4%, but also the province of Quebec in Canada last year, we measured at 3.5%. I think what I would like to do is explain just a little bit more to how we got to this number. And indeed, on this slide, I can tell you just a bit more about the kind of analysis that we've done. What we've tried to do is really just take a snapshot, a bit of a single photo in time of the material flows that are moving through Sweden's economy. And what this diagram shows, obviously a very simplified version of that. But I think a few things already stand out that I can try to summarize here. So obviously Sweden has quite a famously low carbon economy, but it's also quite a highly material intensive economy. Sweden consumes more than twice as much as the global average. And as you saw in the video, that's about 3% of the world's total material footprint, despite representing just about 0.13 of the global population. Obviously, looking at the different sectors in Sweden, it clearly stands out that Sweden's consumption is really standing out in terms of minerals, metals, and biomass extraction. In fact, Sweden is the second highest in Europe after Norway and the fourth highest worldwide. I would also want to note that Sweden has an expanding building stock and quite a thriving manufacturing industry. In fact, almost 1/3 of extraction feeds into meeting the country's societal need for housing. So specifically looking at building stock there. But it's also a key player on the global trade scene. About 90 million tons of exports of final products, as well as about 130 million tons of resources extracted abroad to satisfy Swedish needs through import. If we move to the next slide, what we can see is how that picture, how that snapshot actually equates to some key metrics. And I'd just like to walk you through maybe just a few key metrics behind that 3.4% that I mentioned earlier. So obviously starting with that 3.4%, what we're really talking about here is something specifically called socioeconomic cycling. And this is the share of second materials entering the economy over the total material consumption of the economy. If we look just above that 3.4% number, you'll see blue and an orange flow. And both of these stand for non-circular flows, so typically fossil-based energy carriers, but also non-renewable inputs, things like metals, plastics, and glass, etc., mostly embodied in consumer products. I think what will draw your attention is that big green line, and that's actually something that we call ecological cycling potential, quite high at 36%. And what we're showing here is actually the share of renewable primary biomass. So think wood, food crops, agricultural residues even. And that's being consumed within the Swedish economy. And actually notably, this flow we've estimated to be carbon neutral. And as much as we would really like to show that that is a part of a circular flow, we're unable to really concretely demonstrate that those nutrients of that biomass are able to be cycled back to the earth. And I'm happy to talk about that a little bit later. Finally, the outermost sort of gray chunk is the net additions to stock. And that's quite high, nearly 40% in Sweden. And just think about all of the materials that almost get, not permanently, but get sort of concretely put into the Swedish economy, like roads, houses, even long-term goods like durable materials, vehicles and such. Maybe just moving on to the next slide, I think the question comes to mind, I mean, how do we make sense of these metrics, and how do we use these insights basically to drive action, and what are the perspectives from here now that we have that snapshot of the current state? What we've done is explored a variety of scenarios, 6 scenarios, and these are typically classified as counterfactual scenarios, basically what if scenarios. And I think really what we're trying to do here is provoke thinking about a possible future, rather than really well-defined, feasible kind of normative solutions. We're really exploring what could be. So for each of these, I'd just like to give you a sense, and not to spend too much time on each of them, but just to give you a sense of what we've explored in this study. Obviously, construction and constructing a more circular built environment, that's going to be critical. As you've seen by that big gray flow, that's the representing the biggest material footprint, quite a sizable carbon footprint as well. So some things that we've explored here are increasing renovation rather than demolition and new build, but also really prioritizing secondary materials for new construction where it has to happen. We've also explored cultivating more of a thriving and regenerative food system. And again, food system, as probably many of you know, huge impacts on the carbon footprint, and a key lever for change in terms of climate change. Really what we've looked at here is avoiding the incineration of food waste, either by preventing food waste generation in the first place, or by regenerating flows like anaerobic digestion. We've also looked at how we could reduce consumption, specifically of high impact products like meat or heavily processed foods as well, with low nutritional value, and tried to play with those numbers. But also looking at manufacturing, how could we use the infrastructure that we have and actually increase the lifetime of the machinery and the equipment and the assets, as well as exploring some sort of higher R strategies. So looking at repair, reuse, or even things like rental services. On the next slide, I can explain the final 3 of the scenarios. So we've also looked to the degree to which we could help reshape extractive industries by exploring the boundaries of limiting the expansion of future mining sites, also expanding protected areas for forests and marine life to limit biomass and fish extraction. We've also looked at mobility, and that's a key one, especially considering the fact that Sweden is a not very dense country, but quite a large country. So to the extent that we could incentivize other models like car sharing or carpooling over ownership, but also just the need to, or the reduce in need for mobility by increasing flexible work. And I think that's something that we've seen change quite quickly over the pandemic. Finally, we've also explored a few scenarios under conscious consumables, reducing the need for production and use of plastic items, using more recycled fibers in textile production, and designing equipment to be smaller and more lightweight. So where does all that bring us? If we go to the next slide, I think it's quite a significant change to the metrics that I've explored with you before. So if we kind of add up all of those scenarios and explore the big what if question of what a future, some more circular Swedish economy could look like, we see actually that Sweden could boost its circularity metric by over 200% to 7.9%. I think more notably, the material footprint consumption would be lowered by a remarkable 42%. And I would just want to say, that sort of future circularity metric of 7.9% is still slightly under the global average, but I don't think that implies that this is not a good score or not a score to aspire to. We still have to acknowledge that the character of the Swedish economy, similar to our recent studies in Norway and Quebec, there are large extractive industries, meaning that the denominator of this metric, the total resource consumption overall, will always be disproportionately large relative to the numerator, the fraction of material cycled domestically. Maybe just moving on from the metrics picture on the next slide, what we were able to do with this project and also in collaboration with RISE is explore a little bit of, what are the root causes behind us not achieving more of a circular economy today, and diving deep into what are the specific barriers and blockers that are maybe holding us up, and how could those help us sort of sharpen the point of our recommendations and get to actions that are immediate and effective from policymakers, but also businesses today. So maybe I can just quickly touch base on each of these. So we looked at 4, so legal and regulatory first. I think we see is still that circularity is quite maybe immaturely defined, and it could be expanded more broadly, it could be incorporated more broadly into regulatory language and policies. And I think things like setting maybe mandatory targets for secondary material use through government procurement could be actually one way of spurring innovation in this area. When we look at maybe more economic and financial root causes and actions, I think what we see, maybe unsurprisingly, is that the way that our economics really work today and the way that markets work today is really rewarded around kind of linear models. And I think what we see across the board is that business models are still largely linear, and it's difficult to compete with circular offerings. Again, I think there's a role for public sector here through procurement to really drive market stimulus and demand. But I think looking also at maybe more support mechanisms or incentives to perhaps incorporate the true cost of materials and explicitly prioritize and incentivize the use of secondary materials could begin to change that economic environment. We've also seen that there are a number of technological and capacity-based challenges, and I think here we would really need a bit more time to obviously talk about the specific technical challenges within each value chain. But I think looking at, again, how institutions and businesses can explore solutions for more reuse, repair, remanufacturing is still quite difficult. And even actually looking at high value material recycling, there are still a number of very specific technical challenges there. And I think promoting the continuous improvement of technology, but also by setting ambitious targets, I think that can really drive technological innovation. Finally, cultural and behavioral. I think, clearly we're all very embedded in this system, and we can all recognize that indeed product ownership is still preferred, or is at least easier than things like sharing or renting or leasing. It's largely more convenient. And I think, that cuts a bit both ways, in that producers, businesses are also really driven towards more sales and more turnover, rather than building communities of leasing and reuse and ecosystems in that direction. But I think here, also building awareness in the way that consumers think and shop, but also the way that businesses can offer new solutions and new solutions for consumers to behave and to consume in a more circular way. obviously there's a lot more behind this, and I've really just skimmed the surface. So maybe just on the final slide of my talk, I would really encourage you to download the report for yourself. It's a great read. I think there's a lot of great information, and we really talk a lot about specific strategies for Sweden to become more circular. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much, and I'll hand it back to you, Klaus.
Thank you very much, Matthew, for that great summary of the report. It's now time for Elin Larsson to take over the stage here and as the moderator of the panel discussion. And also, we'd like to invite all the panelists to turn on the cameras and join us. So please.
Yes, thank you, Klaus. So this report shows us that Sweden has barely started its transition from a linear to a circular economy. So we still have a very long way to go. And Sweden's material footprint is the third highest among all EU countries, coming in at 25 tons per year per person. So there's a lot of radical changes that needs to be done. So with me here today to discuss the report, I have Anders Wikman, Chairman at Circular Sweden and Chairman at Climate Kick. I also have Jenny Svärd, Director of Environmental Policies at Confederation of Swedish Enterprise, Svante Axelsson, National Coordinator at Fossil Free Sweden, and of course Matthew Fraser from Circular Economy. Welcome. So I will start with you, Anders. I know you've been working with environmental questions and pushing for circular economy for many years. What's your reaction to the report, and were you surprised?
Well, good morning, and thank you for having me. And thank you, Matthew, for a very good presentation. I think this is a landmark report. This is a very, very important report. I have one problem with it, and this is the 3.4% circularity metrics. I think when you present it that way, you somehow give the impression to people that we could be at 100%, and that's of course not possible. So I have a little bit of a problem with the methodology, and I don't think the 3.4% is really the main message. The main message is that we can, through a number of measures with regards both to production, and I would like to underline specifically to consumption, we can reduce our footprint significantly. And I think this report gives a lot of good evidence how that can be made, and also indicates the policy measures that are needed. So by and large, a very good report. But the 3.4% don't pay too much attention to that, because I don't think I like it. For instance, I mean, if 40% of the materials that we use during a year are being embedded, and some of them embedded for 50 or 100 or 150 years, it becomes very difficult to talk about circularity in a figure like 3%. So, and also fossil fuels is another issue. They are dissipated. We can't cycle them. Of course, it becomes different when we have more wind, solar, etc. Then we have a big impact when we start to recycle and reuse materials. So with those reservations, a very good report. Thank you.
Thank you, Anders. And I think you're raising a lot of questions that needs to be raised. And I was thinking, Matthew, maybe you want to reflect on some of these. I mean, for instance, 3.4%. Is 100% circularity, is it even possible?
Yeah, thank you. And I very much appreciate Anders' feedback. In many ways, I really agree. I think, maybe just to quickly answer your question, Ellen, I think looking at 100% circularity, I mean, it's just really not practically feasible when you look at how an economy needs to work. I think largely what we've tried to do 4 years ago by establishing our very first global report was just put a metric out there. And in many ways, when the circular economy theme, I guess, really first started taking hold, we were really almost operating in the dark with very little metrics. And in a sense, what we were trying to do is put one metric out there And I think with the metrics that we have now being able being reported on a country level, we're really trying to make that comparable with the global metric. So at least we have some relative benchmarking. But I think what we're seeing also, and again, going back to Anders' very wise remarks, is that actually what we really need is a more, let's say, expanded dashboard of metrics. So what's really going on? Indeed, he mentioned additions to stock that are locked in for hundreds of years, possibly. How are those managed? Things like emissions that are just dissipated, never to be recovered again, unless we talk about carbon capture and storage. We really do need actually to lean into this complexity and understand also where are these very specific levers that we can pull to become more circular.
Yeah.
And Elin, if I may just add one comment, and that is, I think the management of stocks is probably the priority number one in a more resource efficient circular economy. The longer we can use a material or a product, the better. So if we focus only on what is going around in circles, we are missing part of the picture. But I think we agree. So we need a dashboard that is more fine-grained.
Yeah, thank you. Totally agree. And of course, this is a first step. And I think this measurement is really important just to start this debate and dialogue, to be honest. Jenny, what's your first impression of the report and the findings? Do you have any thoughts?
Yes, thank you also for an interesting presentation, Matthew, and for inviting me to this panel. Well, we need to go towards towards a more circular economy to reach climate and other sustainability goals, and the transition is on its way. But I agree with the authors that we need to speed up the pace. It's interesting to measure the status and progress of circular economy. However, this is not an easy task, as has been described, and the results definitely needs to be treated very humbly. The outcome of the analysis that Sweden is 3.4 circular shows that we have a lot to do still. But the result doesn't show the whole picture of the circular economy in Sweden, since some parts are excluded. For example, it doesn't address the circularity in manufacturing processes, the use of residues or reuse, and use of other circular business models as repair and remanufacturing, etc. And it would be interesting to hear the author's view about how this could be included maybe in the coming analysis. I also agree with Anders about that it is problematic to describe Sweden to have a 96% circularity gap, since 100% is not possible to achieve. And I think this should be emphasized very much in the report. And the report shows that the material consumption per person is high in Sweden, and there are several reasons for this, of course, that's also is described in the report. Sweden is a large country with few inhabitants per square meter, has a high living standard, and a country rich of natural resources, and that have a significant export as well. And the final products often reach their end of life outside Sweden, where material recycling may occur, and this is not either accounted for in the report. And the export from Sweden also contributes to lowering CO2 emissions internationally, and this is why it's problematic to solely have a national focus in this analysis, is my view. And we agree with the authors that Sweden and Swedish enterprises in particular are well placed to take on a leading role in the development of the circular economy. Swedish business community is on the forefront in sustainability and are putting much effort in becoming more circular. So it was very interesting reading the report. We also have some comments about the strategies and so on, but maybe we'll come to that later. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. I will actually get back to you on some of the remarks later on, but I first would like to hand over to Matthew to, I guess it's mainly two questions that you might have to answer here. Is that how come we are only measuring the recycling part? Circular economy is a much broader scope. What do you see? Will we be able to measure that in the future? And then the problem with national versus global analysis.
I think again, great points. I would also just acknowledge within the scope of the methodology that we're applying here, these are clear gaps. I think actually when we do look at scenarios, that's actually where the magic really shows through, in that we are able to explore strategies for slowing, narrowing, leaning towards more regenerative materials that aren't necessarily captured in that snapshot metric that I was explaining. That being said, what we are exploring now in two ways is looking at more dynamic material flow modeling. And that actually just takes into account how materials are flowing over time. And that gives us insight into well, ways for slowing and regenerating and narrowing rather than just cycling. We're also developing a report actually specifically looking at a circularity gap in the built environment. And I think that, obviously being the main lever, looking at the broad extent of the built environment and how that really connects to many societal needs, I think that's actually going to be a key way to resolve a lot of the questions that you pose. But in terms of let's say the international scope, I mean, this is also something that we're really bound by our access to data. And one way that we're trying to overcome that in actually ongoing, but hopefully in the very near future, is to look at, let's say, supranational regions. So looking at, for instance, Nordic countries or Scandinavian countries or the EU as a whole, and actually how that works as an interconnected region. Waste flows, not always, but tend to flow regionally, or at least there are the opportunities. And I think that would give us a bit more insight into how that kind of larger picture could increase circularity, both nationally and in that broader context.
Yeah, and yeah, because it is difficult. I know to where you put the scope, and I know that the extraction industry has had some criticism about the findings in the report, and for instance, saying that mining in Sweden is more circular and sustainable than in most other places. And does it make sense to have a scenario when we limit mining in Sweden? Is that maybe sub-optimizing? And why not have a scenario with more mining in Sweden and less in other countries? And Matthew, you are free to take it off, but the others, Svante, Jenny, and Anders, you are also welcome to join into this statement.
Well, I would just add quickly, I think obviously looking at kind of comparing Swedish mining, as you've given the example, relative to other countries, I mean, that's just not something that we were able to do clearly within this report. I think it would definitely make an interesting follow-up study. I think the point is taken. However, we're also coming at it from a slightly different perspective. We're saying, how do we make better use of the materials that we have first, and only then kind of really look at what we would need to extract. Clearly, though, this is a rapidly changing global picture. The global energy system is moving away from fossil fuels and more towards things like batteries, solar panels, wind turbines. And what that actually creates is a more demand on minerals mining, or metals mining, I should say. So clearly there's a much bigger, much more global picture that we need to take into account. I think in a sense, that really just does go beyond the scope of our study. And we took the precautionary principle by looking at how we can manage materials that we have better first.
If I may add, Elin, I would like to say that I think what is most interesting in the report is not so much production, but rather consumption. We have a footprint per capita in this country between 25 and 26 tons. If you go to Africa, south of Sahara, the equivalent footprint is around 2 tons. And they have to raise their living standards, obviously, and that will require more materials. Maybe they can reach a good living standard at 8, 10, 12 tons or something like that. But we cannot continue to be on this very high level. So I think that's the main, that is really the main challenge for a country like Sweden. Because if everybody had 25 tons per capita, the whole planet would be destroyed. So here is really the challenge to me. But I agree, the difference between mining techniques, etc., that's an interesting issue, of course.
Svante or Jenny, do you want to add something to that?
I can give briefly comments on the presentation, and thanks for being invited to this seminar. I think we are longing for this report, of course. It's very crucial report to solve our problems different way. And I think this is the right time to talk about circularity more deeply. We have a very strong focus on fossil free and the climate issue, of course, but now we need to take more wide scope to solve other problems. And I think we need help from the circularity to really manage to be total fossil free in the whole world. But I'm also interested in discussion how we can, I mean, the devil are in the details. And if we want to have a succeed to give an acceptance of this perspective, I think we also need to think about how wide scope do we think is smart in this situation? How many problems do we want to solve by circularity? And I think we can get strong oppositions if we talk about less consumption or that type of language. I think we need to take it step by step, and I think we need to focus on the crucial things that most of the people support and agree on, but we are very, very unlucky that we can't succeed. And I think this more efficient discussion compared to the less consumption is one very important step. I think also for Sweden is of course very, exciting, you can say, if we talk about biofuels and biomass in this way, as we do in this report. We got a strong opposition of how we handle that, as we see is a better solution than fossil energy and fossil products. So I think in that perspective, we get a strong, bad feelings in many sectors. I think also it's interesting to see how, as we said for 1 minute ago, how we compare different countries between each other. Because Sweden are special as other countries. We have a lot of natural resources, a lot of forests, a lot of mines, and we need to be fair when we compare different countries. Otherwise, this report will don't be accepted. So I think we have some methodological challenges, so we can transpond this report into the Swedish context. It's the first comments.
Totally agree with you on that. And maybe these country reports is like a puzzle where you finally build the whole global report to see where how different things are important from different countries' perspectives. But Svante, if I continue with you then, you've been very successful with creating these roadmaps for a fossil-free Sweden. How do you see, is circularity a part of those, or can they be, or what's the next steps happening there?
I mean, the succeed of the process in Sweden now is that we take step by step. That's the crucial thing, because people are evaluating and develop their thoughts when they take step by step. If you want to solve too many problems from the starting point, you don't get the support from the people and the parties. So I think circularity is very popular. People, I think, love the thoughts and the perspective, and most of the people, and I myself, see it is necessary to have this circularity. Otherwise, we can't solve the fossil-free Sweden or fossil-free world, and we can also don't solve other problems, because we have a lot of different problems. My circularity is a key issue to handle different issues. But I'm afraid about the language, because we can get the same problem as we talked about GMP and all that, and the growth debate. I think we need to be smart and focused on the sub-indicators here, and to get a strong support for this part and with this perspectives. And then we can take step by step and widening the discussion. But if we take too wide perspective now, we get a lot of opposition.
And even though you would take it step by step, could you interlink sustainable resource use and climate as one question still?
Yes,
Do you
of
think-
course. It's if you look at these roadmaps, many of them say that circularity is a way forward. Otherwise, we can't solve it. I mean, if we talk about construction and buildings, there we have a lot of challenges. How we use concretes and how we transport cement and materials, very, very inefficient. So if you look at for example, in the construction sector, there's support circularity. And they want to ban the word waste because that's an old perspective to talk about waste. We need circularity to handle the fossil-free challenge.
Do you have any comments on this, Anders?
Yes, of course I have. Well, I agree with Svante that the language used and the metrics used, those are very important issues. But I think it's important to realize that human needs can be met in many different ways. Take mobility in a city, for instance. I mean, you have one extreme that you replace all the combustion engines with electric vehicles, and you have less emissions, of course. But you still have a lot of resources required for that to happen. If you instead develop a system where you have better public transport, you have better opportunities for biking, you have mobility as a service, you have car sharing, you need far less vehicles. So the total system is more resource efficient and you have less emissions. And I think that example shows you that human needs can be provided for in many different ways. Another example that Matthew, in your report, you mentioned is that we have a very high degree of one-person households in Sweden compared to other countries. But that's another issue. A lot of space per person. Maybe you could reduce that space. I think it has to do with cost. The main problem in resource efficiency is, of course, that the cost structure in the economy is still such that virgin materials are most often less expensive than secondary materials. And if that is the case, I mean, you will waste materials. It's very, very simple. So I think a tax reform is probably the most important policy measure. But those are just some comments. So it's not primarily a question of reducing consumption. It's trying to analyze how do we meet human needs? Can we do it in a less resource wasteful way? And I think the answer is obviously we can.
Yeah, I totally agree. You raised your hand, Jenny. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, so I just want to, I mean, circular economy is a very important tool to reach the climate goals, of course, and other sustainability goals. So it's mainly a tool to reach them. And I think we need to have a holistic view when we look at the circular economy, because it's an economic shift. And I think there's too little discussion about that. There's a lot of focus on rather narrow policy measures and so on. But this is an economic shift in the society, and it involves all disciplines and all ministries and so on. And I think we need to be on that level to really find the solutions forward. Because as someone mentioned before, we mainly have a linear society today. All policy is basically based on the linear business models. So we have to look at all of the policy areas and see, okay, how can we adapt them to promote the circular business models? And one key issue for us is to create good market conditions for the circular economy. Because if we find that, if we can get that, then this will speed up in a much higher speed. So that is one of our aims, to try to work for better market conditions for the circular business models. Thank you.
Can I add something there?
Yep.
I think we have the main discussion here, and the crucial thing is, of course, the competition between the secondary materials and the primary materials. And I really love that what Anders said about tax reform and the correct prices and all that. But I don't really believe that we have time to waiting for that, because it's very, very difficult. We have seen that for many, many years now. We are talking about tax reform, and myself really believe that in many, many years. But how we see the distributional effects of the right prices and a really strong tax reform, it could be very, very difficult to introduce that in the society. I think the code system is more hand-on and smart and are really supported from the business perspective and also from the consumers. So I mean, if we have quotes on textile, on plastics, on batteries, on different materials, I think we create a market, a strong market, and it's hands-on and it's not so big distributional effects. So I think that's the main tool in my perspective. Different quotes in many ways are very, very popular in different sectors.
What do you say, Anders? Do you agree? Or did you want to comment on something else?
Yeah. I mean, to put requirements on a certain percentage of used or secondary materials in new products, that is surely coming. The European Commission put forward a proposal about a month ago, and it contains that element. So I agree that that's an important step. But I think the economy would be enormously bureaucratic if that was the only tool we used. So I think correct prices ultimately would be the best.
And what is that?
Pardon?
What is the correct price?
Well, you have to charge producers for the externalities, the so-called externalities. I don't like the term externalities. It gives the impression that that's something on the side. It's not on the side. It's it's a core issue. But the external effects, both social and environmental, if they are not paid for, we have a distorted competition. And we see that. I mean, I was chairman of the Swedish Recycling Industry Association for many years, and you would think that secondary materials would be a very profitable area in the economy today. Apart from a few exceptions like scrap metal, they are not. Plastics, it's new plastics is so much cheaper. So recycled plastics is almost impossible. So I mean, there is something in the cost structure that we have to address. And I agree, it's not easy, but you could do it in the European context. It's big enough, the market is big enough. And I think the European Commission will push that issue. I hope so, at least.
I agree. Jenny, what do you say? Would that make a good market conditions to really transform the industry and make, have good business without producing or extracting too much resources?
Well, I merely want to comment on what is going on the EU level right now, because the inner market in the EU is very important for the development of the circular economy across Europe. And the EU has a very ambitious agenda for circular economy, which we support. And we will see in the coming years a number of new regulations and other measures that will really promote the development of circular economy. And we are following this very closely and support it and are engaged in this. So I just want to mention that it will happen a lot on the EU level and that we believe that this is very, very positive. So that was the main comment that I wanted to make right now.
Yep.
Ellen,
I think
Ellen, can I say one thing?
Yeah, sure.
I mean, if we, I think the main approach should be to try to answer the question, why is the model today linear? Well, it's obvious, because resources were abundant 100 years ago when industrial society started to develop. And then the other issue is that producers almost never paid any cost for the damage they made. And those two issues together are really the background for the linear model. And if we want to change that linear model, we have to do something about the cost structure. It's very simple.
Yeah.
I think it's right.
And I would add, we are moving into a digital economy where jobs will be more and more scarce. Doesn't it make sense to lower the cost on labor? I think we should not tax labor in the future. We should tax capital and we should tax resource use. That would be a good model.
Yeah. And I guess that would be you answered the question that was the next one, that if you were in power and had the possibility to change one thing, is that your answer?
Yeah, absolutely.
Svante, do you want to add something on that?
I agree with what Anders said, of course, in the long perspective, but I've been as Anders, you know, we have worked for this for so many years, and the step is not so very strong. What we see really have a strong impact on the transformation of the society just now is regulations. I mean, we have very lack of time, and we have been successful with the eco-design perspective. We have some products has gone on from the market. We see the regulations on the vehicles is not the price on the fuels. It's the regulations that make us that we now see electric cars. We see a reduction law that Preem in Sweden now invest in biofuels. Is depend on that we have a regulation on reduction of emissions. Yeah. And I think investments in Borealis, they see that they want more or less regulations that we need to put recyclable plastic into all products, and that's why they invest in plastic refineries. So I mean, the quote system reduce risks for the investors, and it's very acceptable. So that's my first priority just now.
Thank you. And Jenny, really shortly, the final words from you. What would you, if you had one thing you could change, what would that be?
Okay, yeah, it's a hard question. It's so much that I wanted to change. Well, as I mentioned, I really would like the holistic perspective of circular economy to have a larger place in the discussion, and also that there's more discussion about this as an economic shift, because we see a need to also change, like you also wrote in the report, Matthew, accounting rules, for example. I mean, there's so much policy areas that we need to look at, and if we can adapt them to the circular business models, then they can become more profitable, and then the transition will speed up.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you so much for very insightful discussions. And to sum up, I will follow up on Anders actually talking about change of behavior, looking at the construction sector, that maybe the most bold buildings are the ones already built, or the most bold buildings are the ones we start using in new ways to optimize the space. So it's really, we have to change the rules of the games. It's time for bold leaders that dares to take bold decisions. And I'm so happy to hear all those ideas that came up in these discussions. Let's hope someone grabs them and creates a change. Do you want to wrap up, Claes?
Yes, thank you. So with those insightful words, it's time to wrap up. We apologize if anyone had some issues or problems with the sound of the video. It is available on YouTube, and it will also be available on LinkedIn later during the day. I think Angelica also will post some links in the chat. I also apologize if you didn't see Matthew during his presentation, but you got to see him now during the panel discussions at least. We have also had discussion in the chat and tons of questions. We will try to answer them by email, all of them later on. So the report is now out. I hope you all will read it and share it. But most of all, I hope you really will get inspired to take action and do something. Pick one or two of the actions there and make sure it happens. And finally, I would like to thank the project team for really hard work, a very humble attitude, and for great discussions along the way. So thank you all for watching, and let's end with a video again, hopefully with sound this time, and goodbye and take care.